Members of the Union Board and extended Union community, I'm deeply honored to be with you as you recognize the establishment of the Currie Family Professorship in the history and mission of the Church. Like you, I regret that because of the pandemic, your board cannot gather in person. I was looking forward to seeing some old friends and to celebrate with you the remarkable ministry of Union Presbyterian Seminary over many generations. But of course, our disappointment, though real, seems a small thing compared to the disaster that has come to so many worldwide. We remember them and pray for God's mercy. And Nan and I remember Union and pray for the seminary and its board as you make what undoubtedly will be extraordinarily difficult decisions. May God give you wisdom and courage, and trust that the God who did not abandon Union in other hard times will not abandon the seminary now, and that a new vision and new opportunities for service will, by God's grace and mercy, be yours. And so we gather around our computers or phones. I'm grateful for the invitation to be with you conveyed by John Rogers and Richard Boyce, and for Tim Moore, who has handled with such patience the logistics for this lecture. Not an easy thing to do with an old professor who still likes to use a blackboard. I want to acknowledge for all of us that the Texas Currie family has provided over the years remarkable leadership to the Presbyterian Church and through it to the Church Catholic. Like many of you, without slighting other members of the Currie family, I am particularly grateful for the faithful ministry of Tom Currie, especially for his brilliant and moving essays published in the Journal for Preachers. But Tom, in his own modest way, has often pointed to his father, evidently a much-loved but formidable patriarch in the family. In an email to me, Tom wrote, "My father's formative theological influence that stayed with him throughout his life was that of the student volunteer movement, especially as embodied or articulated by the likes of John R. Mott, Sherwood Eddy, and Francis Pickens Miller. My father was a liberal evangelical of a type one does not see much of today. That is to say, he combined a fervent faith in evangelistic missions around the globe and at home, especially new church development at home and all manners of missions overseas, with deep commitment to liberal principles of equality and freedom of conscience and intellect in both the church and the world. His gift was the major source of this chair, or at least the initial source, and represents his interest in the missional impulse of the gospel. A historian, he received his THD from Union Theological Seminary in Virginia under the tutelage of Ernest Trice Thompson, a particular hero of his. We're all grateful for Thomas White Currie's legacies in the life of his family, in the life of the church, and now in the life of Union Presbyterian Seminary. Tom's mention of E.T. Thompson reminded me of my own deep indebtedness to Union, where I too received my doctorate in church history. Thompson's 3-volume History of Presbyterians in the South has literally been immediately behind me in my study as I, like many of you, turn to it when I have a question about the institutional history of the old PCUS. But of course, it was my Union professors, Jim Smiley, Ross McKenzie, and Ken Goodpasture, who are the direct inspiration for my work as professor of U.S. religious history at Columbia Seminary. In particular, it was the always curious and demanding Jim Smiley who was my doctor father. Even after I was a tenured professor at Columbia, he was still sending me assignments. I'm genuinely grateful for him and for all the ways this old seminary, with new visions, has been and is a servant of the church. What I want to do in this lecture is to reflect very briefly on Thompson and Smiley and what seems to me to be their understanding of the study of the church and the church's history as a resource for the mission of the church. Their historical work emerged from and addressed what they perceived to be pressing issues for the church's mission in their time. In the original draft of this lecture, I had then turned to some 19th century Presbyterian missionaries had used careful historical investigations as a resource for their missionary labors. But the emergence of our present crisis could not be ignored. The lecture has consequently been rewritten in the hope that it might be of some help as we struggle with the mission of the church in the midst of a pandemic. After a brief introduction on Thompson and Smiley, I want to explore with you how some 19th century Protestant missionaries and mission leaders responded to the threats of pandemics and of those endemic infections regularly found among particular people or in a certain area. The hope, of course, is that their history, their stories, can be a resource as we struggle with questions about the mission of the church in the present crisis. But first, a word about Thompson and Smiley as a way of introduction and as a way of thinking about a link between history and mission. Despite his 3 fat volumes on Presbyterians in the South, Thompson spoke of the dead hand of the past. He saw the white Southern church mired in what he called the backwaters of U.S. life, and he was eager for the church to move out of the backwaters into what he called the mainstream of modern America. Beneath his voluminous historical work was a missional vision for white Southern Presbyterians to internalize a progressive modern worldview. That worldview included a historical critical method of biblical interpretation, an irenic ecumenism, and a concern for social justice. Beneath Thompson's work as a historian was the challenge of white Southern Presbyterian nostalgia for a mythic past with its protective theological orthodoxies that served as props for a Southern way of life, a way of life where whites had one place and blacks suffered the deep oppression of another. His histories served the missional purpose of bringing the white Southern Presbyterian church out of the backwaters of the American South into the mainstream of progressive American society. While Jim Smiley shared many of Thompson's commitments, he faced a very different social and cultural context. One way to read the work of Smiley is to see him facing not so much cultural nostalgia in the church as the forgetfulness that was shrouding both U.S. society and the life of the church that he loved. Much of his work came as U.S. society was becoming increasingly dominated by the ideology of a free market economy and by a therapeutic culture with its ethic of self-realization. Smiley's work was consequently in the context of a powerful consumer capitalism and its individualistic culture in the pursuit of self-fulfillment. Both the economic individualism of the free market and the therapeutic individualism, what sociologists have called expressive individualism, were undermining confidence in institutions, including the church, and encouraging a deep amnesia in American society. Again, one way to read Smiley's work as a historian is to see him fighting forgetfulness in the church. He would chase down students in the hall and give them assignments precisely because he believed that remembering was essential for the life and mission of the church as it faced the challenges of contemporary society. How, for example, was it possible for the church to address the racism in church and society without some understanding of its deep roots and lingering wounds? His wonderfully cluttered desk symbolized for many his eagerness to keep stories alive and to understand how the past was continuing to shape the present as the church faced the contemporary challenges of mission. Now, with this introduction about a link between history and missions, I want to turn now to our present crisis, our context, and ask how missionaries and mission leaders in the early days of the mission movement in the U.S. understood and responded to the profound challenges of pandemics and endemic infections. Is it possible for us to gain some insights from their history, their stories, as we think about the mission of the church today in our present crisis? We must acknowledge, of course, that there were pandemics that struck the U.S. and endemic infections in the U.S. in the 19th century, harsh realities that are not much remembered today. But missionaries were being sent and readily going into parts of the world whose ecologies were deeply threatening to their health and lives. Infectious diseases killed great numbers of missionaries and their families, especially in certain parts of the world. Between 1800 and 1860, the early period of the U.S. Protestant international mission movement, 3 cholera pandemics raged across the world, beginning in India and spreading to Southeast Asia and China, to the Middle East and East Africa, to Europe and North America. The pandemics killed millions. In the early 1820s, as U.S. missionaries were beginning to arrive in India, 100,000 Indians and 10,000 British troops died in the pandemic caused primarily by contaminated water. American missionaries arriving in China would be hard hit by cholera, as would those in the Middle East. A transportation revolution, an early expression of globalization with dramatic improvements in travel across land and water, accelerated the spread of the disease to many parts of the world. The Russian Empire, for example, had over 2 million people to die of cholera during the closing years of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th. Other diseases that were particularly threatening to missionaries included typhoid fever caused by contaminated food and water, smallpox, yellow fever, and TB, especially in areas of great poverty and dense populations. For example, John Adja of Charleston, Presbyterian missionary to Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, lost 3 children as well as a visiting sister-in-law to typhoid, and watched colleagues die of TB while he himself almost died of smallpox. The great killer of missionaries in West Africa, however, was malaria, and it is to that mission field and the missionaries' experience of and response to malaria that I want to turn. U.S. churches and the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions were reluctant in the early decades of the 19th century to send missionaries to West Africa. Europeans and European Americans died like flies when they ventured onto the West African coast. Indeed, malaria had long acted as a kind of African shield against any invasion of whites, and as a vengeful fury that pursued those white slave traders who dared to linger too long on the African coast. The American Board, the primary mission agency for Presbyterians and Congregationalists during the early decades of the 19th century, thought that the best strategy was to find a white Southerner to establish its first mission in Africa. Southerners had long been exposed to malaria, country fever, they called it. They, of course, did not know that it came from the bite of a little mosquito, but thought that it came from miasmas, the noxious vapors that arose from tepid waters of swamps and the rice fields of the South Carolina and Georgia lowcountry. Enslaved African Americans possessed an inherited resistance to malaria, and the board assumed that white Southerners, because of their long exposure to malarious fevers, were more likely to survive in West Africa than whites from other parts of the world. John Leighton Wilson of South Carolina and his wife Jane Bayard Wilson of Savannah were the first to answer the board's call for the establishment of a mission station on the West African coast. They freed their inherited slaves, established mission stations, first at Cape Palmas, Liberia, and then on the Great Gabon estuary near present-day Libreville. Through schools, the development of dictionaries and grammars for the Grebo and Mapangwe languages, and the translation of portions of the Bible into those languages, they sought, with colleagues who soon joined them, to build an indigenous clergy for the establishment of a truly African church. They vigorously opposed the international slave trade, and Leighton Wilson was a great champion in the face of a rising scientific racism of Africans and the impressive civilizations of some West African societies. They, with other early colleagues, managed largely to avoid during their time in West Africa the white paternalism that was to mark so much of the mission movement in the late 19th and early 20th century. But the Wilsons did not avoid the onslaught of malaria that hit them less than a year after their arrival at Cape Palmas. Jane Wilson recovered rather quickly, but then Leighton was struck by the fevers. For months, he fought for his life. It began with a sledgehammer attack of fever. Soon his tongue was covered with what looked like a brownish fur. He became sick at the stomach and began to throw up bile as the fever climbed. And so the disease progressed day by day with rising and cooling until he became delirious and his lips became purple and swollen. Jane struggled to keep her young husband alive on an African cape above the Atlantic. Finally, some Peruvian bark, quinine, was tried, and he began his recovery. The next year, they were joined by a young couple from New England. He died within a month of reaching the Cape. She lingered in great distress and loneliness. A ship's doctor came ashore and shaved her hair off and applied blisters to her head, her breast, and her feet. He gave her calomel and opium, but nothing stopped the raging of the fever. And in great pain and deep loneliness, she joined her husband in death. It was a story that was to be repeated over and over again among whites who arrived on the West African coast. A young African-American printer from New York, B.V.R. James, arrived at Cape Palmas, and he too was struck by the fevers, but he never became so seriously ill as the white missionaries, perhaps because of an inherited resistance to malaria. He would, during the coming decades, print thousands upon thousands of Bibles and tracts in the Grebo and Mapangwe languages for those being educated in the mission schools. With Union's long connection with Ghana, some of you, no doubt, know of the way British and German missionaries died in appalling numbers among the Ghanaians along the Ghanaian coast and in the interior. William Walker, the Wilsons' closest colleague, lost two wives. The first almost as soon as they reached Cape Palmas. The second, Zanaya Walker, a year after arriving in Gabon. Earlier in that year, she had given birth to a son who had breathed a few breaths and died. When she died shortly afterward, Walker was devastated. The reality and greatness of my loss, he confided in his diary, presses upon me with increasing force. I want to ask someone to wake me so that I may escape from this dreadful, suffocating feeling and look once more upon the face of my dear Zanaya. He felt alone and surrounded by darkness. If I sit in the house, all is desolate, and if I go out, double desolation meets me on the threshold as I return. Later he wrote that he believed she was in a better world, but I weep because I have a human heart. But I pray for reconciliation and try to school my heart into submission. I'm not conscious of cherishing my grief, though I know there's great danger of it. I feel the obligations of duty to the living around me. I hardly know my own heart now. The violent repression of grief as well as pain only makes it more intense. I desire to lie passive in God's hands. The furnace is hot indeed. May God give strength according to my day. Later, he was to write to a New England friend and say, I have not yet got rid of the feeling that I was responsible to the board and the church and the mission, and more than all to her friends for the death of my dear wife. You cannot imagine the unutterable agony I have endured from this feeling, and often thought it would be a relief to me if I could cry out to them all and say, I could not save her. What a terrible name is this Africa. Are all who tread her soil forever to cry from the dust in agony of spirit? Yet Walker remained, working hard at the translation of the Bible and for the building up of an indigenous clergy in Gabon. The Grabo and the Mapangwe, among whom the Wilsons and the Walkers worked, sought, like other peoples in other parts of the world, to understand the causes of sicknesses and death among themselves, as well as among the missionaries. And what they did, again, like other peoples, was to search for the person or persons who caused the sickness or death. They knew, of course, that people might be dying because of fevers raging through one of their towns, or that a man might have died because he slipped and hit his head on a rock. But the question was, why were the fevers raging? Or why did the man slip and hit his head? And while they might acknowledge multiple causes for such misfortunes, they looked beneath any empirical reasons for some sinister intention and act. The grudge of a neighbor, or the jealousy of a husband who utilized sorcery to inflict harm. In order to discover the specific cause of a misfortune and to identify the person who had inflicted the harm, they relied on divination in what was called a red water ordeal to reveal the agent of the misfortune. Often they focused their attention on aliens in their midst. For the Mapangwe, these were generally their slaves, agricultural workers brought from the interior to labor on their farms. Not unlike Europeans who turned on Jews with great violence in times of plagues, the Mapangwe were deeply suspicious of the other, the outsider, and killed those whom they thought responsible for any misfortune, including sickness and death. Such a response, so common in societies all around the world, is a warning to us as the lines along outside gun stores around the country, and as attacks grow on persons perceived to be dangerous aliens responsible for the spread of the present pandemic. When the Wilsons had been commissioned for their work in West Africa, Rufus Anderson, head of the American Board and one of the great leaders of the mission movement in U.S. history, came from Boston to Philadelphia to lead the service. He began by insisting that the Wilsons be careful about their health. News had recently arrived about the death of some missionaries, and many Christians were, he said, becoming discouraged about a missionary effort because of pandemics and such diseases as malaria. The preservation of life, said Anderson, was consequently especially important in order to avoid deeper discouragement among mission supporters. Anderson, however, showed himself to be a child of the Enlightenment, as he expressed great confidence in the progress of science as it sought to ease the terrors of infectious disease. He insisted that science, together with experience and intelligent piety, was opening a way especially for a West African mission. Soon, he said, malaria will cease to be regarded as the mere agent of blind fate or chance. The connections between cause and their effects are fast being developed in these latter days. He confidently predicted that science would soon provide a life preserver for missionaries as they entered the miasmas of tropical climates. The Wilsons and William Walker and their missionary colleagues shared, as children of the Enlightenment, confidence in science and its ability to eventually find cures. And they themselves experimented with what might work to break fevers and restore health. They soon learned that bleeding, cupping they called it, was a deadly practice. And they eventually abandoned the old practice of blistering to try and raise the vital signs of the ill. They used opium and calomel and other familiar drugs and began to experience more and more with Peruvian bark, quinine, trying different amounts and at different times during a fever to see what worked best and what amount a person could tolerate. But in the midst of their frequent suffering and griefs, they, like the Grebo and Mapangwe, also looked beneath empirical causes and medical experiments to ask a deeper question of why. And what they found when they asked why was not sorcery or the breaking of some taboo or the malicious intent of some outsider, some alien, but the providence of God's will and purposes. They believed that human history has a purpose and a direction guided by the Holy One of Israel, the God of the Bible, who uses natural causes for God's own good, loving, and just purposes. The tension between natural causes and God's providence marked the missionary world. Indeed, it marked with growing intensity the world of much of 19th century Protestant life as it encountered an increasingly secular understanding of human life and human history. For these West African missionaries, the tension between history being driven by natural causes and being guided by God's providence was ultimately resolved by the deep and unfathomable mystery of God's being, the God of the Bible, who had declared in Isaiah, "For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." This high and holy one, they believed, had revealed God's self most completely and clearly in Jesus, the Word made flesh. And what they believed Jesus revealed was God's love and gracious purposes that sustain and guide human history, even the seemingly inexplicable suffering and sorrows of human life. At least that was what they believed in their best moments, when they caught a vision of something new on the horizon, something they believed God was doing, creating a vibrant African church led by an African clergy. They saw the possibility that someday African Christians, with their deep spirituality, would be an example for Christians in other parts of the world. So we find ourselves in the midst of a pandemic, and we too are eager for science to find answers that will save lives and end the terrors and loneliness that are accompanying a rapidly spreading virus. We want, and want in a hurry, scientific solutions, and we want knowledgeable and responsible political action to administer the solutions. We believe, like Rufus Anderson, that science will soon provide a life preserver, and we want that life preserver thrown to us quickly so that we may embrace it and have our loved ones embrace it and have the whole wide world embrace it. We also find ourselves and people all around us asking questions about the meaning of this pandemic for us and what we can learn about it, from it, about ourselves and our U.S. society. As we make our plans and wash our hands and practice social distancing, we are finding limits to human capacity that reveal themselves perhaps most clearly in the brave and exhausted faces of medical workers who appear on our TV screens. We know something is wrong, something hasn't worked, that our carefully constructed systems have some deep, fundamental flaws. We've been so sure of our power, so sure that we could act with impunity as we recklessly consume the earth's resources, so indifferent and hostile toward neighbors in need, so preoccupied with ourselves and our comforts and entertainment. And now we are feeling a shaking of the foundations. We sense that something is happening that goes beyond what we can see or predict. We don't know what's going to be on the other side of this pandemic. What we do sense is that hungers are being revealed that are not satisfied by consumer culture, including the hunger to watch children once again playing together in a park, the hunger to have a meal with friends, the hunger to sit and hold the hand of a loved one in healthcare. What is the mission of the church in this crisis, we wonder? Pastors and church leaders are responding in a variety of creative ways as we watch frightened people fill grocery carts to overflowing and parishioners and neighbors experiencing the isolation and loneliness of social distancing and the anxieties of no paychecks. And we are watching hospitals being overwhelmed with the sick and funeral homes with the dead. But beyond these hard and demanding immediacies, we're confronting mysteries that go beyond the cause and effect reasoning of the Enlightenment. Mysteries that invite us to modesty and to wonder. What is God, the God of history, about in this crisis? What is God's mission, the Missio Dei, in this pandemic and its aftermath? And among our wonderments are questions that link us to that great cloud of witnesses who have gone before us, including missionaries like Leighton and Jane Wilson, B.V.R. James and Zanaya and William Walker, who can speak to us in the language of Enlightenment reason, whose science is so important for us these days. But they can also speak to us in our mother tongue, the language of faith, which we long to hear. This great cloud of witnesses, they have their stories to tell. And as they tell their stories, they call us, like those in Hebrews 11 and 12, to lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, the sins to which we are most easily exposed in contemporary America with our hubris and insatiable quest for more. And we, in the midst of our anxieties, hear them cheering us on, encouraging us to run with perseverance the race that is set before us in this crisis. The stories of our ancestors in the faith, their history, call out to us in our mother tongue to look and see who is going before us into the midst of this pandemic. Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. This great cloud of witnesses, including these early missionaries, is surely encouraging the church in these hard times to trust God's good purposes, to claim the freedom of the gospel to act wisely without crippling fear, and to be servants to the world as disciples of the crucified Jesus who goes before us and calls us to follow him.